Vamos a empezar la mesa de trabajo dedicada a la antropología filosófica, en la que se van a presentar los trabajos de Piotr Janik, Miriam Ramos Gómez y Jadwiga Guerrero. Bienvenidos. Disponemos de media hora para la presentación de cada trabajo. Al final, de cada uno podremos abrir la sesión de preguntas para el público a fin de poder dialogar un poco al respecto. Vamos entonces a empezar con el trabajo de Piotr Janik. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for your assistance. We are going to start the work dedicated to philosophical anthropology, in which the works of Piotr Janik and Miriam Ramos Gómez and Jadwiga Guerrero. We have half an hour for the presentation of each work. At the end of each one, we can open a question session for the audience in order to have a dialogue. Okay, let's then start to the work. Piotr Janik, he's Jesuit philosophy doctor. He's philosophy doctor. STL aim is in computer science. Current academic rank assistant professor, Jesuit University Ignatianum in Krakow.
Yes.
Institute of Philosophy. Special philosophical interest, phenomenology, hermeneutics, semiotics, logic and discourse, philosophy and humanities, hermeneutic, ontology, computer science, cybernetics, membership, Polish Phenomenological Association, the International Association for the Study of the Philosophy of Edith Stein, IASPES, and recent books and journals to be published next year, Edith Stein, Approach to the Empathy Due to a Presence, International Philosophical Current Life, The Reasons for an Utterance Toward Human Conversation. Piotr, very nice to meet you. Please submit your work. Stein's living concern for the human experience.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. May I share the screen? Yes, maybe it's possible. Yes. Okay. Stein's living concern for the human experience. My speech is divided in 3 points: intentionality of Stein's approach of lived self-giving, the personal note, phenomenon of authenticity, and the truth of human life. To make a point from the beginning and perhaps even make you feel a tension that Stein felt in addressing the topic of Einfühlung, that is, there is a problem of how is possible an understanding of the other in the relationship as personal and not subjective, that is, imputed. Roman Garden, in his lecture published in Polish in 1971, says in this regard, Husserl dealt with empathy in the context of the difficulty that every idealist encounters in order not to be condemned as a solipsist. How is solipsism to be avoided when talking about the pure I and the pure consciousness of the philosophizing subject? All this is by no means a starting point for Edith Stein. Probably she did not know anything about it either, because she did not know any Husserlian manuscripts at the time. The question of clarifying the possibility of mutual understanding between people moved her most, that is the question of the possibility of creating a human community, which was very necessary, not only theoretically, but also for her life, in such a way for herself. It's not just a necessity, indeed a long prepared crisis, quotation. But there is also something else. In her very own words, taken from the letter to Ingarden, it is impossible to complete a study of the person without entering into the question of God. And it's impossible to understand what history is. Of course, I don't see it at all yet, but as soon as the idea is ready, I want to approach these things. Those are the questions that matter to me. Ingarden's approach meets Stein's, especially from the perspective of shared values, but there are lacunes. One of the lacunes comes from not addressing himself the issue of the genesis of the sense of history, or rather the sense of I from within a becoming an I, that is due to the lived experience and time, or in other words, the sense, the very own history. In his investigation of man and time, working on it between 1937 and 1946, Ingarden states finally, so to the reference to the way in which, against the background of the second experience of time, the constitution of myself for me occurs, does not allow us to resolve the difficulties into which the existence of two different and incompatible experiences of time has led us. For although the reflection on the way in which my I is constituted for me strongly undermines my conviction that I exist as a human being transcending my present experiences and my present time. It's not able to overthrow this conviction completely, nor it's able to make me believe that this way of learning about myself and constituting my human I excluded that this I exists in itself, and this is it appears in experience. This is a task that we are not equipped to solve today. Stein, on the contrary, not only devotes her energy to analyze of the sense of the history, but the issue can be considered her leitmotif. The similar gap, but at the same time also a nuance, can be traced in Ingarden's controversy with Schaller of the objectivity of values, and in this regard, a pronouncement of the existence of some values, however, not yet given in existence, that is, as findings. Ingarden notes. What is important at this point is only that is in posing this question, I do not have in mind any ideal objects or ideas, but only something that, while existing effectively as a particular determination of individual object, is itself individual, and while existing in a particular connection with that object, makes that object a good in the Scheller's sense. However, it can be argued that the question of the way in which values exist is formulated in too general a manner, since it claims that all values, regardless of their kind, exist in the same way. Contrary to the statement of not being able to solve the task, Ingarden sketches a solution, but without realizing it. For sure, for what matters in the phenomenological perspective is the finding that is something that, firstly, while existing effectively as a particular determination, secondly, of an individual object, thirdly, is itself individual, and fourthly, while existing in the particular connection with that object, fifthly, makes that object a good. Dealing closely with these points leads immediately to the metaphysical question, which he prefers not to address. Instead, Ingarden invents the term of intentional objects, which are ambivalent, but at the same time are of value to an individual. However, a private thing to what one believes. These creatures or inventions emerge within the language of the artwork and belong to that world. It can be traced back from this position to Bergson, whose works since the dissertation have been for Ingarden a source of inspiration for his research. Thus, Ingarden does not contrast Bergson at this point, as does Stein, who notes, furthermore, we have seen that even in cases where the action apparently follows with the necessity of a natural event, the free ego is merely letting matters take their course, but that it could just as well put a stop to the occurrence. That would certainly be absurd if, as Bergson believes, the ego coincides with the total life stream. That thesis certainly is to be rejected. The willing ego that we have in view, the subject of the resolve, is the pure ego, which Bergson regards as a mere construct of the intellect. Quote, end quotation. Ingarden is right when he points out that the gravity of Stein's research lies precisely in proving empathy, Einfühlung, as experience, Erfahrung, as opposed to the aesthetic account of the time that is of mere emphasized experiencing. There's a case for being more to the point, however. Stein fully subscribes to Husserl's dictum of the return to things in themselves, leading to the tension of finding something or perishing. As Ingarden notes, for Husserl, the experience, also called original, or first, in the sense of the first philosophy, consists in perception of the self-present, self-given things. In other words, to get to know something initially without the help of the substitute data. Ingarden states in this regard, Edith Stein takes up without analyzing original experience, without analyzing it further. In my opinion, this is a mistake. I'm convinced that it is a concept that needs further analysis. For what may sound like I try to nuance this opinion and perhaps even clear up misunderstandings. Above all, Stein differs from Husserl in terms of the idea, intentionality. For Husserl, this means trying to find out how things are on the way to insight, Einsicht. It is a mathematician's point of view, as in the case of Descartes. Not surprisingly, Stein discusses the claim of Hume and not those of Descartes. For Stein, Schiller's position with his claim to follow the heart, as in the case of Pascal and Augustine, lacks presence of the person, as if it were still a theory, or rather a theoretical construction of the heart, and not the heart itself. For Stein, intentionality, Absicht, means feeling, in the sense of the response and the mood, Stimmung, towards the decision, resolve, that is of the unity of free will, or in other words, of one's own acting. The consequence that follows from an idea of intentionality is that of tuning experience, Erfahrung, with experiencing, Erlebnis. In other words, empathy, intentionality can mean neither experience nor experiencing, in this case, if not both at the same time. But differently, rather lived self-giving. But the controversy arises even before these two approaches to intentionality. Gardner is right that the origin of the concept needed to be explored, but to call the leg of such analysis a mistake, in the case of Stein, is excessive. Intentionality, as Brentano introduced the term to his students, including Husserl, comes from the Middle Ages. It is Descartes who assimilates it from the metaphysical doctrine of Suarez. Note Suarez's Disputaciones Metaphysicae are the synthesis of the positions of Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus, or to say more exactly, the third possible position in between extremes, that is the relation. Brentano, after Descartes, advances it with the name of idea, and further, Husserl with that of ideas. It is a mature fruit of the tradition that goes back to the Greeks and takes turn in the person and philosophy of St. Augustine. Brentano calls with term intentionality what was known as mental inexistence. And he translates the term literally into indwelling, Einwohnung. On the one hand, Brentano cautions not to confuse inexistence with existence. On the other hand, he means mental content as Descartes' res, that is, as if it were accessible at hand. Later, the abstract term res in Suarez as aliquid in rerum natura, in common usage, is mistaken for the thing. Husserl's urgency to return to the things themselves is in line with this shift. Not coincidentally, today we return to the linguistic use of the findings rather than the things themselves. Hence, insight, Einsicht, and empathy, Einfühlung, are the two sides of the same source experience. For Brentano, the idea is the proper sense. In the proper sense, is the presentation, Vorstellung. That is the right, given or better true in perception, Wahrnehmung, either by judgment through insight or by love in feeling. Beyond the idea, the unity of experience is not possible at all. Taking into consideration this thesis, the dictum of Augustine's origin, which made history thanks to Anselm, namely credo ad intelligam, requires an update, namely, it's my proposal, credo adjectum ad intelligam. The term adjectum means the in-between, in the way of approaching, that is, the findings of the intentionality. The personal mode phenomenon of authenticity. Stein admits already in 1917 that it is possible to complete the study of a person without entering into the question of God. But this only becomes clearer further on in her subsequent book by Frege, known as Philosophy or Psychology of the Humanities, due to the rigorous investigations undertaken to penetrate into the essence of the sentient reality of the mind from various sides. The topic that opens to such questions is the overcoming of the sensate mechanism, or the mechanism of the individual personality. Stein captures the phenomenon of the influence from beyond that allows one to get out of the mechanism, that is, of the unpersonal response to the situation. And in what sense is it a mechanism? On the one hand, it is the feeding and the consuming energy of life, the function that occasionally fails, There is no desire to do something. Fatigue prevents any action of its own. There is a lack of reason, or one is forced to act, but out of fear. The solution comes thanks to the unexpected visit of a friend, and with whom it is possible to share what is important and close to one's heart. It happens to take the book with the poem to get out of the inner paralysis. On the other hand, by the sense and mechanism, Stein means the natural, in quotation, pattern described by David Hume as an association of impressions besides that of ideas. For Stein, the association of impressions proves ambivalent, that is, it allows a twofold interpretation, that of connection of meaning. The pattern in this light understood as the reproductive course, because thought originated in this sequence once. Put differently, Stein states any phenomenally given associated coherence becomes a manifestation of an acquired capacity of a schema for the future activation of life power. I just try to abbreviate because there is more to say in this regard. The theme devoted to this, okay. The truth of a human life. Maybe it'd be good to go there. What does the truth of life mean? First of all, there are apparently two terms to glimpse. One is that of truth, the other that of life. Nevertheless, they are like the same coin from two sides. About the coin, so to say, in Stein's approach, one can refer to it in three ways. In other words, there are three interrelated areas of analysis, namely the first one, that of the pure ego, pure I, which according to Stein, Bergson regards as a mere construct of the intellect. The second one, that is of the word of life, or the word of values, and the third one, the beyond, the insights, that is of the source of life power. For Stein, unlike Heidegger, truth not consists in the renunciation of something, that is, in the turning one's back on values, because believing in them would be blasphemy. In the contrary, in the engaging, in the context of the lived situation, being considered as test, that is the test of character in the relation to values. Okay, and maybe finally, Heidegger's critique in Being and Time concerning the analysis of subject to values and of the impersonal approach in both Husserl and Scheller of the 1920s does not reach Stein's for one simple reason, namely the product with what is asserted to be authentic in the Heideggerian sense is ambivalent, ambiguous. Therefore, it does not form a reason, which instead is uniqueness. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Piotr, for the introduction. It is a precious moment to be able to listen to works that highly experienced lived Edith Stein, especially because the coherence with which she has lived every stage of her life is a great testimony. And this is precisely what strikes us at the beginning of our philosophy. The experience occupies an important place in phenomenology. I have any questions respect to it. Why do you consider that Stein's claim that a complete study of the person is impossible without addressing the question of God? What do you think?
For her, I think in her very words is looking for the truth. The truth is this issue I try to address, which is the truth of the human life in this sense. So it's the question of God is in the line of the finding of Augustine in this sense, that one arrives to the oneself only after this is this dictum, famous dictum of Augustine, credo ud intelligam. It's the one has to credere, has to understand, to make sense in this sense. This is the question, and I think that Stein discovered this in the same line as Augustine. But there's a point I try to focus, and this is a proposal to change this. Credo adiectum ud intelligam means adjectum is a subjectum and objectum is a way of approaching something. This something, I think, is a psyche. And I hope that Antonio Calgagno will address this topic of psyche, of character, because Stein is on the point on the authentic character, authentic psyche, sentient experience, because she also speak about false character. But this is another. No, not want to go forward.
Many thanks, Piotr. The interiority is important for the knowledge of God in Edith Stein. In this way is San Agustin. This is like, many thanks. Any questions? You write the questions in the chat. If any
yes, can question? I have a question?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Father Piotr. What I would like to comment is that the way you described Stein's relation to truth and faith is very much what John Paul II wrote about her in Fides et Ratio, because he precisely lists Edith Stein among those masters of philosophy who have very harmoniously developed both faith and reason. And I think there is a prevalent reception of Stein as and she's the only woman listed there. There's Gregory of Nazianzus, there's, Bonaventure, Thomas, and many thinkers, but there is one woman only, and that's Edith Stein. I think this is precisely a very prevalent reception of her, somebody who combined truth that is delivered by revelation and truth that can be found by rational philosophical endeavor.
Thank you for this comment, because the point with John Paul II is also interesting because he, as the first in Poland, made translation of Shala of this material ethics, because he was looking for the concept of the person in phenomenology. At the time, he was unable to prove, to find in Shala the concept of person. I made research to prove, to find out why is the case, and this helped me also to understand the polemic with Stein and Scheller regarding the personality, the person in this point. So I was not surprised that John Paul II precisely quoted Stein, or appreciated her thought.
Thank you very much. Let's continue. Let's continue the work of Miriam Ramos. Father Piotr, many thanks for your presentation. Let's continue the work of Miriam Ramos. Miriam, ¿estás por ahí? Es que no te veo, perdón. Perdón, no te veo. Un gusto saludarte.
Muy bien, encantada, Rubén.
Muchas gracias. Vamos a hacer una breve presentación de tu persona. Gracias por estar aquí. Vamos a presentar tu trabajo. Miriam Ramos Gómez ella es profesora de la Universidad Fray Luis de León, el centro adscrito a la Universidad Católica de Ávila. Miriam Ramos Gómez, Philosophy Doctor Europeus University of Salamanca, 2016. After graduate, she was awarded a scholarship for the Philosophy Doctor Program Revision of Modernity, Philosophy, Science and Aesthetics by the Vice-Rectorate of European Convergence, and scholarship for the research staff training, thanks to the Vice-Rectorate for Academic Organization. Miriam, you're welcome. Miriam nos presenta su conferencia Lineamenta de una filosofía del lenguaje en Edith Stein. Adelante, Miriam, por favor, puedes presentar si lo deseas.
Muy bien. Bueno, muchas gracias. Es para mí un motivo de gran alegría poder participar por primera vez en este congreso internacional organizado por la Asociación Internacional para el Estudio de la Filosofía de Edith Stein. Yo he tenido siempre mucho interés en poder participar en congresos anteriores, pero por diferentes razones de diferente tipo no he podido hasta ahora. Entonces, aunque sea en modo online, para mí es un motivo pues, de gratitud y de alegría poder estar aquí con ustedes. Y agradezco a los que han hecho posible la organización de este evento. Es ist für mich eine sehr große Freude, hier bei Ihnen zu sein. Und das ist meine erste internationale Konferenz der IASPES. Ich konnte nicht früher teilnehmen, aber jetzt ist es möglich für mich und ich bin darüber sehr, sehr froh. Bien, por ser el país organizador México y por ser yo hispanohablante, pues daré la conferencia, daré la comunicación en lengua española. Por ello, primeramente quisiera comentar el tema, que es Lineamenta de una filosofía del lenguaje en Edith Stein. Trataré de ajustarme a 20 minutos para que luego pueda dar lugar a preguntas y trataré en este sentido de que sea lo más ágil posible la presentación, porque entiendo que la exposición a las pantallas, así como pues naturalmente el lenguaje online supone siempre una dificultad de cara a la comunicación. Trataré de hacerlo. Bien. Como he dicho, el tema de mi exposición es Lineamenta de una filosofía del lenguaje en Edith Stein. El guión que utilizaré será el siguiente. Haré una breve introducción para exponer el objetivo de la comunicación. A continuación abordaré unas claves hermenéuticas que son necesarias para entender desde el punto de vista biográfico e histórico-filosófico qué habría de entender por la filosofía del lenguaje en Edith Stein. En tercer lugar, expondré lo que a mi modo de ver pueden ser las tres líneas esenciales de esta filosofía del lenguaje steiniana y por último acabaré pues, con una breve conclusión. Introducción. Bien, una de las claves que definen a la filosofía contemporánea del siglo XX es evidentemente el llamado giro al lenguaje. Este hecho, que tiene muchos nombres, sobre todo muchos filósofos vinculados al Círculo de Viena o del ámbito anglosajón, y que ahora no es menester traer aquí, ha supuesto bueno, pues una de las características casi definitorias de la filosofía de nuestro tiempo. Cuando uno analiza este giro al lenguaje, descubre una serie de características de la filosofía, en concreto, bueno, pues especialmente una desconexión del lenguaje respecto a la persona. Por este motivo, a mi modo de ver, frente a esa desconexión que la filosofía del lenguaje, sobre todo de corte analítica, del siglo XX nos propone, me parece, en mi modesta opinión, que la filosofía de Edith Stein nos puede proponer un nuevo concepto de filosofía del lenguaje en el que precisamente la conexión del lenguaje con la totalidad de la persona y en particular perdón, con la dimensión espiritual que la constituye, pues es ineludible. Ciertamente este tema del lenguaje, yo no soy la primera pues estudiosa de Edith Stein que lo aborda, ¿no?, desde el punto de vista de la filosofía steiniana, sino que anteriormente a nosotros pues encontramos, por ejemplo, menciono tres autores que han tratado el tema del lenguaje desde distintos puntos de vista a propósito de la filosofía de Edith Stein, que son pues Reifenrath en esta obra Erziehung im Lichte des Ewigen, die Pädagogik Edith Steins, de 1985. Ahí en concreto Reifenrath aborda el tema del lenguaje desde el punto de vista principalmente pedagógico. Posteriormente, en el 2007, Freienstein, en la obra Sinn Verstehen, Filosofía Edith Steins, aborda el tema del lenguaje en Edith Stein y sobre todo el concepto de lo que él llama imagenismo pragmático. Él lo llama con los términos alemanes de pragmatisches Imagismus, y que es un concepto que él considera clave para interpretar la filosofía de Edith Stein, ¿no? Este autor en concreto ha destacado cómo el sentido es la condición de la posibilidad de la comunicación, así como la influencia del judaísmo en ciertos puntos de la concepción del lenguaje en Edith Stein, especialmente a la hora de hablar de la trascendencia de Dios. También él ha esbozado un estudio comparativo del lenguaje, de la filosofía del lenguaje steiniana con la filosofía del lenguaje heideggeriana, Y por último, encontramos en Ries, en 2010, en la obra Der Weg von Ich zum Anderen, die philosophische Begründung einer Theorie von Individuum, Gemeinschaft und Staat bei Edith Stein, encontramos también aquí algunas indicaciones a propósito de las cuestiones del lenguaje en el marco concreto de la filosofía fenomenológica según Edith Stein. Bien, entonces, en nuestro caso, nosotros vamos a tratar de hacer una breve aproximación al contexto biográfico, histórico, filosófico, al lenguaje como tema en Edith Stein y trataremos de identificar lo que serían las líneas esenciales desde un punto de vista lo más sistemático posible de lo que podemos considerar esa filosofía del lenguaje. ¿Cuáles serían las claves hermenéuticas en este sentido que son pertinentes tener en cuenta para comprender el lenguaje en Edith Stein? Bueno, pues claves biográficas son, en primer lugar, que Edith Stein ha sido traductora de obras filosóficas de gran envergadura, ha sido intérprete de tradiciones filosóficas distintas a aquella de la que ella procedía de origen, que era la fenomenología. Ella ha sido profesora de literatura, lo cual ha sido posibilitado por su formación en estudios de filología alemana, de germanística. Y en la filosofía, ella ha prestado especial atención, como todos ustedes saben muy bien, al tema de la persona. Pues estas claves biográficas, que darían mucho jugo cada una de ellas para comentar, nos permiten otear el horizonte biográfico en el que el tema del lenguaje es algo con el que Edith Stein se confrontó de modo práctico y de modo también objetivo, ¿no? Desde el punto de vista histórico-filosófico, ¿qué claves hermenéuticas nos permiten trazar también un horizonte de comprensión pues, adecuado a la filosofía del lenguaje de Edith Stein? Bueno, pues en primer lugar, la obra Investigaciones lógicas, en concreto la primera investigación lógica de Husserl sobre expresión y significado, donde aborda con hondura el tema de la expresión, el concepto de expresión, el fenómeno de la expresión y sus distintas modalidades, pues ese concepto, como veremos, pues, es un concepto clave que influye muchísimo no solo en la concepción de Edith Stein acerca del lenguaje en sus obras fenomenológicas, sino también posteriormente en las obras incluso las que su filosofía se nutre más de la escolástica. De hecho, precisamente la cuarta cuestión de Veritate, que trata sobre la palabra, das Wort, pues precisamente el comentario que Edith Stein hace a esa cuestión en su traducción de la misma refleja el interés que ella presta a la exposición del Akinate y a la distinción entre palabra del corazón, palabra interior y palabra exterior. ¿Por qué? Porque eso en cierto modo conecta muy bien con las distinciones que a propósito del fenómeno de la expresión ella había vislumbrado y muy bien descrito en su tesis doctoral sobre la empatía. Por último, también pues otra clave hermenéutica importante desde el punto de vista histórico-filosófico de la influencia intelectual de otros autores en la propia obra de Edith Stein, pues ha sido la mística de Santa Teresa de Jesús, la de San Juan de la Cruz y la teología simbólica de Dionisio el Areópagita, que especialmente en todo lo que tiene que ver con la expresión y el lenguaje sobre Dios, pues es de notable influencia, como también podremos apreciar. Bien, ¿cuáles serían las tres líneas esenciales de la filosofía del lenguaje en Edith Stein? Pues a mi modo de ver serían tres. Frente al carácter abstracto de la filosofía analítica de nuestro tiempo, caracterizada por un racionalismo desconectado de la persona, impersonal, Edith Stein nos propondría una filosofía del lenguaje fundamentada antropológicamente, precisamente conectada estrechamente con la persona. En segundo lugar, frente a la inconmensurabilidad de los discursos filosóficos, por ejemplo, bueno, esta expresión está tomada de la obra de Alasdair MacIntyre, en concreto Tras la virtud, After Virtue, y al conflicto de las interpretaciones, le conflit des interpretacions, de Paul Ricoeur, pues frente a esos desacuerdos propios del lenguaje filosófico, sea moral o sea en otro orden de cosas, Edith Stein nos propondría una filosofía del lenguaje que fundamenta una hermenéutica abierta a la tradición y en este sentido también que posibilita el diálogo entre las distintas tradiciones o concepciones filosóficas. Y en tercer lugar, frente a la famosa y conocidísima sentencia número 7 del Tractatus Logicus Philosophicus de Ludwig Wittgenstein, perdón por la errata, porque Wittgenstein lleva 2 Cs, pues Edith Stein nos propone una filosofía del lenguaje abierta a Dios. Recuerdo que aquella famosa sentencia de Wittgenstein es de lo que no se puede hablar es mejor callarse, ¿no? Y que alude, o por lo menos muchos intérpretes han extraído de esa sentencia la imposibilidad del lenguaje o del discurso moral y la imposibilidad de hablar sobre Dios, porque nada puede decirse sobre él. Bien, entonces, respecto al primer punto, frente al carácter abstracto e impersonal de la filosofía analítica, una filosofía del lenguaje fundamentada en la antropología. Saco a colación este texto de Introducción a la Filosofía que expresa muy bien esto que queremos transmitir. Aquí nos dice Edith Stein ciertas formas del cuerpo vivo que aparecen intuitivamente, así como sus movimientos y cambios, tienen la particularidad no solo de hacer que coaparezca la vida del yo, las cualidades y la peculiaridad individual en el modo en que la sensibilidad llega a ser el dato, sino también de expresarla. En el fenómeno de expresión, la mirada va hacia lo que éste expresa y descansa en él, de la misma manera que al comprender una palabra, el sonido pronunciado o la imagen de la palabra no se halla ante la mirada espiritual como un objeto independiente plenamente constituido, sino que tan solo constituye el puente a través del cual la conciencia aprende, la aprendente tiende hacia su objeto propio, que es el significado. Asimismo, la mirada, la expresión del rostro, los rasgos de la cara significan lo que expresan y dirigen la mirada hacia su sentido, mientras que ellos mismos se convierten únicamente en objetos si se aparta la atención de la dirección natural hacia ellos. Fin de la cita. Bien, este texto nos da unas claves, podríamos naturalmente traer otros textos sobre el problema de la empatía e incluso para fundamentar esto también textos de la misma obra de Caminos del Conocimiento de Dios. Sin embargo, he querido traer este, ¿no? por ser un texto fenomenológico. ¿Por qué es importante este texto? Bueno, pues es importante porque aquí se pone de manifiesto lo que es el fenómeno de la expresión y su importancia para transmitir la vida espiritual de la persona. Es decir, a través de la expresión, a través de los fenómenos de expresión, somos capaces de captar un significado que va más allá de lo que se ve y que me permite a mí captar un sentido que va más allá pues de la apariencia sensible, de lo que se está manifestando. Y claro, este fenómeno de la expresión es tremendamente potente, por lo menos según el análisis que hace Edith Stein. ¿Por qué? Pues es muy potente porque está expresando de un modo que además Francesco Valerio Tomasi lo explica muy bien en un artículo que tiene sobre la Leiblicher Ausdruck, la expresión corporal en Edith Stein. Pues ahí él pone de manifiesto muy claramente también entre esa relación necesaria, ese vínculo esencial, que es en el fondo el que permite hablar del cuerpo como expresión de la persona, ¿no? Como órgano de expresión de la persona. De hecho, en otro texto posterior, que en español ha sido traducido como Verdad, Espíritu y Palabra, creo que en alemán fue traducido en el volumen 9 de la Edith Stein Gesamtausgabe, Wahrheit, Geist und Wort, creo que se llama así. Ahí también dice Edith Stein algo que respalda esto que acabamos de decir. El espíritu da expresión a lo que capta, del modo en que lo capta, y precisamente con ello esa expresión se convierte en expresión de él mismo. Y lo que es interesante es que aquí, cuando hablamos de expresión, no estamos hablando solo y únicamente de la expresión lingüística, sino que Edith Stein entiende el fenómeno de la expresión especialmente en dos dimensiones estrechamente ligadas y con una relación analógica, que son la expresión lingüística, naturalmente, pero también la expresión gestual, la expresión mímica. Entonces, en este sentido, el concepto de lenguaje que deriva de este análisis que hace de Edith Stein, que yo estoy haciendo así muy someramente por ajustarnos al tiempo, acerca del fenómeno de la expresión, y que refleja esa relación ineludible entre espíritu, cuerpo y persona, en el fondo nos está poniendo de manifiesto que no es posible entender el lenguaje únicamente centrándonos en las palabras, como una buena parte de la filosofía analítica tiende a hacer. Y en este sentido se tiende a desconectar de su fundamento antropológico, sino que también hay mucho en la persona que es lenguaje, incluso sus propios silencios y sus propias manifestaciones con el rostro. Y eso también, en la medida en que está conectado con el ser personal, pues eso también debería ser objeto de una filosofía del lenguaje que se precie. Bien, pasando a la siguiente línea. Frente a la inconmensurabilidad de los discursos filosóficos y al conflicto de las interpretaciones, insisto, estos conceptos están extraídos de McIntyre y también de Ricoeur, una filosofía del lenguaje que fundamenta una hermenéutica abierta a la tradición. Bien, aquí, si en la anterior línea el concepto clave era del fenómeno de expresión que nos abre al sentido, aquí el concepto clave sería el de empatía, el de Einfühlung. No tanto para el conocimiento de las otras personas, que naturalmente ahí tiene un gran sentido, sino también para el conocimiento de los objetos culturales, como por ejemplo pues una obra filosófica que me permite el acceso a un sentido de una concepción filosófica diferente a la mía, pero por la que puedo entrar en diálogo, porque también hay una plenitud de sentido que yo puedo captar, ¿no? Entonces, naturalmente aquí habría que ver muchos actos implicados y habría que ver también cuáles serían las líneas o los principios de esta hermenéutica steiniana fundamentada en esta filosofía del lenguaje, ¿no? Pero sin embargo, yo creo que están las bases en Edith Stein para ello. Un texto que a mi modo de ver pues puede reflejar bien esta línea que acabamos de decir es la misma obra de Edith Stein que ella escribió justamente en forma de diálogo, ¿no? Con ese amor tan lleno de veneración que profesaba a su maestro Edmund Husserl, ¿no? Nos dice, poniendo en bocas de Tomás de Aquino, no hemos dudado nunca, ninguno de los dos, se refiere a Husserl, de la fuerza de la ratio. La gran hazaña de usted ha consistido en desenmascarar el escepticismo en todos sus modernos disfraces y en arremeter enérgicamente contra él. Pero la ratio para usted no ha significado nunca nada más que la razón natural. Mientras que yo, en este punto, hago distinción entre razón natural y razón sobrenatural. Claro, aquí Edith Stein no solo está poniendo en Tomás de Aquino las palabras que ella cree que Tomás de Aquino le dirigiría a Husserl, sino que está poniendo también las palabras que ella misma ella puede poner fruto de su esfuerzo de luego pues, apreciarse con gran estima la figura de Tomás de Aquino y su filosofía. Pero claro, ese esfuerzo que ella hizo pues repercutió positivamente en ese acto empático de adentrarse en la filosofía de Tomás de Aquino, repercutió positivamente, como digo, en un diálogo con la fenomenología y viceversa, que como sabemos pues fue muy fecundo y que todavía pues, puede decir mucho a la filosofía de nuestro tiempo. Por último, la tercera línea, miro el tiempo para ajustarme a él. La tercera línea es frente a la sentencia número 7 del Tractatus de Ludwig Wittgenstein, una filosofía del lenguaje abierta a Dios. Aquí el concepto clave es el de experiencia, de Erfahrung. Saco a colación el texto de Edith Stein en Caminos del conocimiento de Dios. No recuerdo bien el título en alemán de esta obra, Caminos Innere, es su obra sobre su comentario a la obra de Dionisio el Areopagita o el pseudo Dionisio. Dice Edith Stein, le es connatural al lenguaje humano transferir los nombres de las cosas y acontecimientos sensibles a los espirituales. Hablamos de viva alegría, de negra fatalidad, de cólera ardiente. Cuanto más cercano a lo natural es un lenguaje, cuanto más concreto el pensamiento, tanto más vivas se sienten estas relaciones. Pero, ¿cómo es posible conseguir a partir de las cosas, de la experiencia, algo que está más allá de toda experiencia? Cuando Moisés designa a Dios como un fuego devorador, no lo hace ni en base a un proceso del pensamiento natural, ni quiere estimular en ese sentido. Él ha experimentado a Dios, ha estado ante Él y ha sido impactado por Él. Y lo que Él ha experimentado ahí no lo puede expresar de otra manera, sino con esta imagen. Quien conoce a Dios lo entenderá. El ateísmo en diferentes personas quizás hay que tomarlo en muy diferentes sentidos. Si con ello se piensa que se trata de la negación de la existencia de Dios, entonces hasta esto mismo pertenece al hecho de que se da a la palabra de Dios un sentido y según la exigencia, incluso el mismo sentido de los creyentes en Dios, puesto que se quiere negar lo que creen. ¿En qué se fundamenta esta exigencia? Quizás el mismo ateo fue antes creyente y se acuerda todavía de lo que él entendía por Dios. Pero ¿cómo llegó originariamente a ese conocimiento? Posiblemente a través de una educación creyente. Se le habló en casa y en la escuela de Dios y lo aceptó sin pensar, como tantas otras cosas que aceptó de buena fe, sin llegar a un convencimiento personal. Sin embargo, hay que pensar que nuestra comprensión del lenguaje se desarrolla juntamente con nuestra experiencia y nuestro completo patrimonio espiritual. Claro, esta última frase, fin de la cita, ¿no? Caminos del conocimiento de Dios, esta última frase verdaderamente es muy pertinente para el propósito de esta pequeña comunicación, ¿no? Y es que nuestra comprensión del lenguaje está vinculada con nuestra experiencia y por eso solo la experiencia de Dios permite un lenguaje auténtico sobre Dios, ¿vale? Ciertamente, el tema de la inefabilidad del lenguaje sobre Dios, que ella desarrolla quizá más en las obras en las que comenta la obra de Santa Teresa de Jesús y de San Juan de la Cruz, esa inefabilidad no significa nunca una imposibilidad de captar o de poder expresar algo de esa experiencia, aunque siempre persista pues la cuestión de fondo de la analogía entis, que siempre hay pues una mayor desemejanza entre los dos términos de la analogía, en este caso entre la criatura y Dios, pues que una semejanza, ¿no? Bien, y por último, para ajustarme al tiempo, pues en conclusión, pues muy brevemente, podríamos decir que en Edith Stein hay bueno, pues, fundamento para hablar de una filosofía del lenguaje fundamentada antropológicamente, que esta filosofía del lenguaje ofrece una alternativa a la visión que muchas corrientes, especialmente vinculadas a la filosofía analítica, sin hacer un juicio negativo sobre ellas, que hay aspectos de la filosofía analítica que son naturalmente de valorar, pero ofrece una alternativa en este sentido, pues a mi modo de ver, que completa algunas carencias que esa desconexión de la persona que ofrece muchas veces la visión del lenguaje de la filosofía analítica mantiene. Y por último, pues en este sentido creo que también esta reflexión acerca del lenguaje y vinculada y derivada especialmente de su análisis del fenómeno de la expresión, en el fondo ofrece una prefiguración ya pues en los años 20 y 30 del siglo XX de la concepción que Juan Pablo II desarrollará posteriormente en su Teología del Cuerpo, donde con tan gran acierto él afirma que el cuerpo es el lenguaje de la persona. Hasta aquí termino. Muchísimas gracias por su atención.
Muchas gracias, Miriam, por la presentación tan puntual, por los tiempos tan precisos que has cuidado. Y bueno, yo quería decirte que he tenido la oportunidad de leer tu libro, Edith Stein y el de Veritate de Tomás de Aquino, y me parece un trabajo sumamente interesante. Además, porque en él muestras precisamente el arduo trabajo por el que pasaba Edith Stein para traducir, entre otras cosas, el pensamiento de Santo Tomás, ¿no? Pero además adaptándolo a un lenguaje fenomenológico. Y en tu libro cuentas de estos avatares por los que pasaba, y me pregunto, por un lado, si a estas dificultades es a las que te refieres al hablar de una filosofía del lenguaje en Edith Stein. Quiero decir que en otro momento he escuchado al profesor Walter Redmond que ha abordado también precisamente algunas líneas que confluyen entre la filosofía analítica, la tradición analítica y el pensamiento de Edith Stein, y me parece sumamente valioso. Y además eso, en primer lugar, eso, ¿no? Si estas dificultades tienen que ver con esta filosofía del lenguaje a la que te refieres, lo has mencionado al principio. Y por otro lado, esa es una. Y por otro lado, y para terminar, sería que precisamente en el tema del lenguaje nos enfrentamos a un gran problema cuando abordamos los problemas relacionados con la mística, porque precisamente allí, no hay una falta de experiencia, sino precisamente un desbordamiento de experiencia y también un desbordamiento de sentido que hace que Edith Stein pues aterrice finalmente todo en los terrenos de la mística, ¿no? Aunque no puede haber un lenguaje propiamente auténtico, como tú dices, bueno, ¿qué pasa con esta experiencia que al final nos desborda y se nos escapa, ¿no? Este problema.
Muchas gracias, Rubén, por las dos preguntas. Respecto a la primera, las dificultades a las que me refiero de Edith Stein a propósito sobre todo de su traducción y su enfrentamiento, o bueno, más que enfrentamiento, es una palabra que no me gusta, a su adentramiento en la filosofía de Tomás de Aquino, pues son de diferente tipo. Bueno, lógicamente, Tomás de Aquino hablaba en latín, escribe en latín, y entonces pues hay una dificultad idiomática, no porque Edith Stein desconociese la lengua latina, que la dominaba con bastante maestría, sino porque especialmente significa acercarse a una lengua que no es la mía, es la que yo vivo. Yo la puedo dominar, pero no es la lengua física en la que yo vivo. Pero más allá de las cuestiones de traducción, que bueno, pues también desde el punto de vista filosófico implicaba que el concepto de ratio había que traducirlo de diferentes y múltiples maneras en alemán, entre otras cosas, estaba sobre todo la cuestión de fondo de que poner en diálogo la fenomenología husserliana moderna del siglo XX con la filosofía escolástica de Tomás de Aquino del siglo XIII ha significado y significó para Edith Stein, a mi modo de ver, pues un acto de empatía. Un acto de empatía, porque cuando uno está, esto lo expresa muy bien en su prólogo a la traducción, cuando uno vive en su casa de conceptos, dialogar con el que yo sé que procede de otra fundamentación filosófica distinta a la mía es muy difícil. Entonces es muy fácil caer en el mundo de los prejuicios y caer en el fondo en el mutuo desconocimiento y en un diálogo de besugos, en un diálogo de sordos. Y claro, no hay cosa peor que un diálogo de sordos, porque todos quieren hablar, pero ninguno quiere oír. Entonces, en este sentido, pues la filosofía de Edith Stein es un acto de empatía y en este sentido, pues la misma fenomenología propició también ese adentramiento, ¿no? Y el subsanar esas dificultades que ocasionaba. Y respecto a la segunda pregunta, efectivamente hay una sobreabundancia en la experiencia mística que es la que posibilita, sin lugar a dudas, esa dificultad de poder expresarla, pero el uso de imágenes, que es principalmente la vía que utilizan los auténticos místicos de todos los tiempos, tiene una legitimidad, no puede ser desechada sin más y que incluso la propia teología de Tomás de Aquino la garantiza, ¿no? Y Edith Stein incluso pues en esta obra a la que he aludido pues fundamenta pues toda su validez, ¿no? Con Caminos del Conocimiento de Dios. Espero haber respondido brevemente, pero al menos en algo a las preguntas. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Si alguien más tiene alguna pregunta, any questions? Por lo demás me parece un trabajo sumamente interesante.
Y agradezco mucho la anotación sobre Walter Redmond, no sabía que tenía también algo trabajado a este respecto, así que lo anotaré, porque como somos tantos los entusiastas de la filosofía de Edith Stein, a veces no es posible ser educado en citarlos y en mencionarlos como se merecen. Así que gracias.
Sí, de nada. Bueno, pues si no tenemos más preguntas o comentarios, pues vamos a pasar al siguiente trabajo. Muchas gracias, Miriam. Finally, let's hear the word of... Moment, please. Jadwiga Guerrero, Van der Magden, welcome. She is editor of Edith Stein Studies, very Roman and ample, level 5. She presents the paper Dr. Crucis, Criteria of Establishing the Doctors of the Church and their application to Edith Stein's example.
Yes, thank you very much. I will start right away because there's very little time. As stated, I'm going to ask about Edith Stein's church doctorate in this presentation, and I will present to you a theoretical investigation, but if you are interested in how things are looking here in Vatican, so more like sociological observations about what is the state of her candidacy, then I can also answer those questions at the end. But first, let's start with a big question. Edith Stein is widely recognized as a saint, a martyr, and a victim of Holocaust, also as a female philosopher. But can she be a doctor of the church? 26 figures, including 4 women and 32 men, carry the title due to their so-called eminent doctrines, eminentes doctrina, While there is no martyr, nor has ever been on the list of doctors, Congregatio de Causis Sanctorum reached the conclusion that martyrdom is not in principle an obstacle in awarding the title. Therefore, a question can be posed: does the heritage of some Christian martyr fulfill the criteria of the Church's doctorate? And I can here let you in on a secret. Congregatio de Causis Sanctorum was investigating whether martyrs can be doctors of the Church, not in reference to Edith Stein, whose application is not yet formally filed. So the aim of my speech is to investigate the criteria of conferring the title of the Doctor of the Church, prime among which is the criterion of eminens doctrina, the eminent doctrine, a outstanding teaching, and apply them to one example, that of Edith Stein. But in order to highlight some issues, I will contrast her candidacy with other ongoing applications, mainly two. The first very serious candidate to be another doctor of the Church is Irenaeus of Lyon, and he is also a martyr. And the second very significant candidate, who perhaps is also just a matter of time, is John Paul II. And I consider the question historically and philosophically, investigating possible lines of argumentation. I'm not speculating here much about what's likely to happen. If you would like such speculations, we can talk later. So since the 13th century, the Catholic Church has honored people whose life has been recognized as holy, and whose contributions to the developing doctrine or spirituality meet the criteria of eminens doctrina, with the title Doctor Ecclesiae Universalis, Doctor of the Universal Church. And it's very important that you here recognize this adjective universalis, because it is only when a certain authority is recognized as really having global effects, global influence, that they can be considered the doctor of the Church. And the tradition of granting some thinkers the title doctor predates the 13th century, but it is really the letter Gloriosus Deus, written in 1295 by Pope Boniface VIII, which named the first 4 Latin doctors and established their holiday in the liturgical calendar. However, the official practice is earlier, and it is since 16th century that it is expressed by papal bulla, first of which was Mirabilis Deus. So currently the title is given to 36 figures, 32 men and 4 women, majority of which lived antiquity or the Middle Ages. And as I said, there is nor ever has been any martyr on the list of doctors. And this is due to a particular reason, which I will talk about later on. And as I said, the biggest competition to Edith Stein is Irenaeus of Lyon and John Paul II. So those candidacies are subjects of the investigation of the Congregation of the Causes for the Causes of the Saints, Congregatio de Causis Sanctorum, in the context of the procedures for conferring the title. But the congregation is an authority responsible for carrying such processes, while the acceptance is first given by the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, and the final decision is made by the Pope. Benedict XVI granted 2 doctoral titles during his pontificate to Hildegard von Bingen and John of Avila, and Pope Francis bestowed the title of the Doctor of the Church on the Armenian mystic Gregory of Narek, and that's pretty much it, nobody else yet. So, as for Irenaeus of Lyon and John Paul II, the official positio has been already filed, and in the case of Edith Stein, the positio is not prepared, but the procedure is entrusted, of course, to the general postulator of the Carmelite order, the Carmelite order. So, what are the criteria of establishing a doctor of the church? So customarily, the concept is defined based on the definition of the father of the church, but I will not go into the details of what constitutes the criteria of establishing fathers of the church. Also, fathers of the church is an informal title insofar as there is no authority or institution that ex auctoritate establishes who can be called or cannot be called father of the church. It's more of a tradition of whom we call like this. The general criteria are the chronological affiliation to antiquity, doctrina orthodoxa, so the orthodoxy of teachings, approbatio ecclesia, so recognition among the ecclesiastical community expressed formally or informally, and then sanctitas vitae, so the sanctity of life. But when it comes to the church fathers, they don't need to be officially canonized, and in the early years of the church, in ancient church, the opinion about the sanctity of life of someone was often expressed by translation, that is a transfer of a body to a more dignified place. And we call people who were never officially canonized fathers of the church as well. So the title of the doctor of the church is formal in the sense that there are very strict rules and criteria of establishing, and there is no room for debate over who we call a doctor or not. So the first preliminary condition is also historical in the case of doctors of the church. And basically what distinguishes doctors from fathers is that they do not need to meet the criteria of antiquity, but at the same time, they cannot be from the era preceding ours. They have to belong to our era. So no Old Testamentary figures can be doctors of the church because, for a simple reason, they were not acquainted with the message of Christ. The second criterion is important, and that's sanctity of life, but only when it is recognized and confirmed by the act of canonization, or beatification for that matter. But unlike the fathers, doctors must be officially recognized as saint. And this criterion of sanctity of life includes the interesting debate about whether martyrs can be doctors. So since antiquity, martyrdom has been recognized as determining sanctity of life, and martyrs were somewhat privileged. And the privileged status of the death of a martyr was visible in how their canonical processes were organized, because martyrs are dispensed from the obligation of a miracle required in the normal course of the beatification process. And this was the case with Edith Stein. So there is a sort of like a shortcut. When you are a martyr, there is a shortcut to sanctity. However, this means that the life of a martyr is less thoroughly investigated. What is investigated is the martyrdom itself. Therefore, no one ever considered martyrs to be doctors of the church because their life has not been that rigorously investigated as the lives of regular saints who didn't have this dispensation in the process of canonization. However, because of Irenaeus of Lyon, Congregatio de Causis Sanctorum has performed the investigation whether martyrs can be doctors of the church, and the verdict is positive. It states that yes, the love of a martyr can also enhance the splendor of the science. And I believe that particularly in Edith Stein's case, precisely the character of her eminent doctrine, of what is possibly her eminent doctrine, is of a such kind that it is accentuated by the splendor of her science and by her martyrdom. So the most important criterion of the ecclesiastical doctorate is the identification of eminence doctrina, an eminent doctrine, one to be found in the life and thought of a saint. Characteristics of eminence doctrina were first described in the 13th century by the mentioned Pope Boniface VIII, as, firstly, the illumination of revelation contained in the scriptures. This is very important. So originally, doctors of the church were those who explained the scriptures. So the accent was placed on exegesis. And what they were supposed to do, they were supposed to be dispelling the errors, the darkness of the errors, errorum tenebrae fuerint profiligate, elucidating the obscure, obscura fuerint dilucidata, clarifying the dubious, dubia declarata, and explaining the enigmas of the scriptures, scripturarum enigmata reserata. So what was the accent placed on in the 13th century? The emphasis was on biblical exegesis and efforts in opposing heresies, explaining away the darkness of errors. And this is visible in the first doctorates in church, in particular, such as Jerome, who was responsible for editing the Bible, or Augustine of Hippo. After 6 centuries, Pope Pius IX broadened the scope of reference of eminent doctrines to distinguished teachings in morality and spirituality, as exemplified by Alphonsus Liguori and Francis de Sales, respectively. He also added the criterion of a positive influence on the church in bonum ecclesia, and equally important as actuality of eminence doctrine for some areas of life. So, as of today, after further innovations introduced by Vaticanum II, eminent doctrines are characterized as conferred by the Holy Spirit in the form of a gift of wisdom manifested in the testimony of life that has a significant impact on the sanctity of followers. And every word is here important. We need a gift of wisdom that has a significant impact on the sanctity of followers. So there has to be a visible group of followers people who are made holy through following a particular doctor. But it can be a testimony of life, not just writings. So summarizing these historical developments, one can point out to 2 important aspects of eminentis doctrina. Chronologically, first is a contribution to Christian doctrine. So really a kind of a teaching, a major teaching developed in the developed Christian comprehension of revelation. Specifically, after Vaticanum II, what is required is a testimony of life that inspires others to pursue a way of life which leads to sanctity. And either one of these 2 should make a wide and profound influence on the choice. It has to be wide, so it has to be global, the influence of a doctor, and it also has to be deep. So it really has to change the way the faithful think about the mystery of God. Let's say there were wide influences in the church, such as, let's say, some artistic styles, Gothic style, but this wasn't a deep influence. We need a wide and deep influence. So just to give you a couple of examples, the honorary titles which are usually attributed to doctors of the church point to what kind of a doctrine they contributed to or they developed. For example, Ephraim the Syrian is called Dr. Marianus because he is the first theologian to argue for Holy Mary's purity of sin. Cyril of Alexandria is Dr. Incarnationis because he is a teacher of incarnation. He coined the doctrine that was crucial for the church. Augustine of Hippo is, as we all know, Dr. Gratiae, teacher of the grace. He pretty much started a serious debate on what is grace. Dr. Unitatis Ecclesiae, Leo the Great, because he managed to preserve the unity of the church. Dr. Orationis, Teresa of Avila, because her understanding of the phenomenon of prayer is significantly enriched Christian understanding of the subject. And to finalize, Dr. Mysticus is, of course, John of the Cross, because despite the fact that many had and theorized about mystical experience before John of the Cross, it is his thought that really became fundamentally enriched Christian teachings. But as I said, a contribution to a particular doctrine, very well visible in the early years of the church, is one aspect of the eminent doctrine, and another one, accentuated by Vaticanum Secundum, is the example of life. And this is best shown, for example, by, for example, Teresa of Lisieux, who is, not a scholar, nor a theoretician, but a particularly good example of an outstanding teaching that is manifested in the very person herself. So her little path to heaven, very well known, and her description of what it is to be a child of God has illuminated the church about what is God's childhood, which the church knew before her, but it was really the crystal clear example, and that testimony has been very widely accepted in the church, and she has global influence, and she's recognized everywhere precisely through that little path to heaven, as she called it, described in her memoirs, The Story of the Soul. So the question now that I can ask, and to finalize, the last criterion of becoming a doctor of the church is what makes the title formal, and it is the explicit act of bestowing a title performed by the Pope, expressa ecclesia declaratio. So, for example, Pius XII called Dietrich von Hildebrand, his personal acquaintance, a 20th century doctor of the church in one of the speeches. This is not a formal act of bestowing the title. This is merely an expression of a private opinion and personal recognition. But because Hildebrand is not recognized, he cannot be the doctor of the church. And so the title has to be formally bestowed. So does Edith Stein meet the criteria as described of the church's doctorate? As I said, the first aspect of the doctrine is a wide and profound contribution to the comprehension of revelation. So let us consider what is Stein's impact and her predominant reception in the church. How is she seen? So as I'm sure we all recall, during the homily of her canonization, John Paul II paid a lot of attention to the notion of truth, which she, according to him, illuminated. And this is definitely I would say, a dominant reception of her is as someone who has illuminated what truth is. And I will recall to you, for example, the opinion that was left by the Polish student group in Edith Stein house in a memoir book. So they addressed her as the patroness of people who seek the truth. So this is just a random group of worshippers, but that cult of her shows that she is perceived through her contribution to the notion of truth. Also, probably the most frequently quoted words of her are that whoever seeks the truth seeks God, even if they did not know about it. Finally, we remember that she said about her early period of her life that longing for truth was her only prayer. Also, after reading Teresa of Avila's book of writings, she exclaimed, "This is truth, das ist Wahrheit." And she has made an original contribution to the epistemological position of the theory of truth in her Opus Magnum, and die Ewige Sein. So some like to call Edith Stein the teacher of truth. I don't think I agree with that. This is the proposition that comes from my debates with German scholars who accentuate precisely this phenomenon of her. But what are the other possibilities that we can here investigate? So I would recall then again her reception in one of the most influential encyclicals of John Paul II, Fides et Ratio, but she is precisely listed among all those saints who contributed to the understanding of the bond between faith and reason and their symbiotic nature. And Edith Stein, as the Pope writes in his encyclical, he lists Gregory of Nazianzus, Saint Augustine, Anselm, Bonaventure, Thomas, and then John Henry Newman, Jacques Maritain, Etienne Gilson, and Edith Stein in the Eastern context, also Florensky or Losky. Now, this is another suggestion, that her understanding of the relationship between faith and reason is something that contributed significantly to the Church's understanding of this topic. However, her listed on the background of so many other thinkers shows that this is perhaps not that innovative. Also, and this is where I come to the proposition that I find most adequate. So John Paul II began his canonization homily with the words of St. Paul, "As for me, may I never boast about anything except the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ." And I believe that, according to many, including John Paul II, the cross seems to be the red thread in the history of the saint. Almost 11 years later, during the Beatification Mass, the Pope explained Stein's Carmelite name as follows. Benedicta a cruce is blessed by the cross, die vom Kreuz gesegnete. Not simply just Benedicta of the cross, but really blessed by the cross. And Stein's martyrdom in 1942, during Nazi revenge action, is probably the most widely known fact about that saint. So, but she is not just a martyr who experienced and endured unjust death for her faith, but also one who has earlier contemplated the meaning of suffering and presented an answer to an ancient philosophical question, unde malum. And this was observed by John Paul II, who in his canonization homily described Edith Stein as a thinker who pointed out a special meaning of suffering as that of a lesson of love. And he wrote that love makes suffering fruitful and suffering deepens love. And this is the message that we read from Edith Stein. Well, Edith Stein was indeed no stranger to suffering. At the end of her life, she almost clung to the cross, which she earlier chose as her name. She chose the name of the Teresa Benedicta of the cross. She also chose it as her religious motto. Ave crux spes unica is Hail the cross, the only hope, is her motto. And when appointing her a patroness of Europe, John Paul II called her the symbol of the European tragedies of the 20th century. So Stein indeed knew the suffering marked by historical significance, that of a genocide. But she also experienced the usual everyday hardships and pain. She was excluded from the academic community. She experienced heartbreak and romantic rejection by Ingarden, estrangement by her mother after the conversion, the necessity to give up her beloved profession in 1933 when she was forced to drop the position, her mother's silence when their both lives were in danger, and the betrayal by study friends cooperating with NSDAP against Jewish academics. So in all this, she was able to deeply reflect on the meaning of suffering. Early in her youth, in her doctoral dissertation, Stein laid intellectual foundations for the later understanding of the union with the cross by means of the acts of empathy, Einfühlung, with the crucified. Einfühlung, typically translated as empathy, is, according to Stein, an act of accompanying another's internal acts by a different subjectivity. In her doctoral dissertation, she analyzed the criteria and character of such empathic acts. And in her last work, Kreuzes Wissenschaft, she related the topic of Einfühlung to the contemplation of the cross. And in following the internal life of the crucified, she found the strengths that allowed her to accept and realize the gift of martyrdom, perceived by her not as an end in itself, but as a transitus towards the new beginning. So one can therefore identify both a contribution to the Church's doctrine That is the first aspect of eminence doctrine, which is her theory of the union with the cross by means of Einfühlung, laid out in the Science of the Cross, as well as the example of life, that is the second aspect of eminence doctrina, named after Vaticanum Secundum, present in Stein's legacy an example of a martyr. Can she not, therefore, be called Doctor Martyri, or Doctor of Martyrdom, or pointing not to human experience, but the aspect of God's mystery, Doctor Crucis, Doctor and Teacher of the Cross? Edith Stein's life is, I believe, a vivid example of an optimistic martyrdom, one filled with hope. Let us recall what she said in a monastery in Echt when she was moved to hide from the Nazis. She joked about her death, saying to other sisters, "If I shall die, you will finally have the opportunity to sing Te Deum." And in her testament, she also used the typical Carmelite phrase, "Today accept my death with joy." And this is perhaps, she was not, however, she approached the mystery of the union with the cross entirely seriously, having previously followed the path of empathy, Einfühlung with the crucified for many years, and found in him the source of hope and ultimately triumph. For the cross was not an end in itself for her, but a sign opening a new perspective. And that is why, with the monastic motto on her lips, Ave Crux spes unica, pulled away from the desk and work on the last of her books, The Science of the Cross, carrying the chosen name, Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, she accepted the martyr's death. So here I perhaps could go into some doubts and counter-arguments that are usually presented towards her candidacy. I will briefly mention only two. The first one is that there is not enough holy followers of her example that would make her case indisputable. And my answer to that objection is that I think John Paul II, who is going to become a doctor of the church, is himself an example of Stein's follower who became a saint. And I could here recall the opinion of Joseph Ratzinger, who, when he was in 1998 the prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, he spoke at Angelicum here in Rome during the celebration of the 20th anniversary of John Paul II's election to the throne of Peter. And on that occasion, summarizing John Paul II's 20th anniversary of pontificate, he said that there are two women, both belonging to the Carmelite order, who can help us understand the nature and prayer and wisdom which underline the theological reflection of John Paul II during these 20 years of his pontificate. The first one is Teresa of Lisieux, a saint whom he declared a doctor. The second one is Edith Stein, a doctor whom he declared a saint. So Ratzinger singled out Edith Stein as somebody who the Pope was influenced by, and it's a known fact that he was. Many point to similarities between the two. They were both realist phenomenologists. They both referred to Max Scheler in philosophy, John of the Cross in spirituality. They were both personalists. They were both interested in developing Thomists. They were both allegedly mystics. Both very much exploited humanism, that is a reflection in dialogue with numerous traditions of European culture. They were both multilingual, and they shared love for the classics. But John Paul of the Cross was mostly interested in Stein as a martyr, and he singled out the cross as the core of her legacy. The second argument against Stein's candidacy is allegedly her poor exegetics in the face of richer philosophical reflection. And I simply just factually don't agree with that statement. I think that there is exegesis in her writings, not to mention that the exegetic and the contributions to exegesis were traditionally a criterion of establishing the church's doctorate, but they are not always demanded, like, for example, in the case of Teresa of Lisieux. So the last criterion why, of course, she cannot be called a doctor of the church is that there was no official act, and this is why, well, this is still to be arranged or seen if it is done. So I would like to finalize by saying that on Edith Stein's 130th anniversary of her birth and the brink of her 80th anniversary of her death, when we ask her about her legacy, we ought to observe that Edith Stein achieved her fullness in the unity with the cross. Both in her thinking and in her example, she illuminated one crucial aspect of the infinite mystery of God. Her legacy constitutes an example of an outstanding teaching concerning the unity with the cross, a legacy that already can, and some days perhaps will also have to be, called by a proper title, Doctor Crucis. Thank you very much.
Dear Jadwiga, many thanks. We have time for some comments or questions. Any questions?
Well, I can describe a little bit how the situation is here ongoing in Vatican. So in 2020, I believe, I addressed Pope Francis in a letter. I sent him my book and I sent a letter asking about actually stating that Edith Stein should be the doctor of the church. And then I received an answer, which was nothing but diplomatic. There was no yes or no, just simply that yes, she is a great saint. But the very fact that I received an answer has been enthusiastically received in two circles, I would say. So the first one was here in Poland, and Edith Stein's society have gathered a group of scholars who are investigating a little bit her legacy as a possible doctor of the church. And we are possibly going to appeal to the Pope during the 80th anniversary of her death in a formal letter. But another, of course, important center for Stein's doctorate is Vatican and whether the official positio will be written. And after I have received that response, first steps were taken to organizing a community here at Teresianum that would write and file the positio. So the first time the positio was close to being prepared was in 2003, where Polish and French Carmelites united to prepare it, but it was never filed due to various reasons. And now in 2020, efforts were made to organize this committee who could work on the positio. However, due to the pandemic and the lack of scholars, this is, well, it hasn't been finalized. So the first step really is that positio is prepared by the Carmelite order. And once this is finished and this is finally filed to the doctrine of faith, then we can talk further. Because I went and discussed her candidacy at Congregatio de Causis Sanctorum, and I received their criticism. But really the first thing that they say is that there is no formal application. And this is what has to be achieved first.
Thank you very much for presenting so an interesting and topical subject. I remember that the trial of Edith Stein has gone through several difficulties. The first was whether she was really a martyr or not. That problem was overcome, but I gave a lot to talk about. In this case, it is also difficult to speak of Stein as a doctor of the church. In this case, what is the main problem? What do you think about it?
I think the main problem is the lack of holy followers. So when you compare Edith Stein's example to, for example, Teresa of Avila, I mean, many people followed her lead and became saints. When it comes to John Paul II, you can say that pretty much everyone who followed his interpretation of Vaticanum Secundum is a student of his. So he has holy followers. There's also an order of the Knights of John Paul II. In Poland, there are martyrs, communist martyrs who were following his example, like Blessed Father Popiełuszko. And you can point to those people and say, listen, they followed John Paul II's example and they became saints. So the message of John Paul II is bulletproof. It leads to sanctity. We don't have that with Edith Stein. Well, I can find one example, and that is John Paul II himself. But John Paul II was inspired by so many saints. So we need, really what we need, it's an appeal to everybody, we need holy followers.
There are any questions in the chat. Susan de la Peña says, my question will be about why Edith Stein is a doctor of the church, and after this presentation it was answered. Thank you for your talk, was very clear, Jessica Guerrero.
Thank you.
And there are a commentary, good suggestions to discuss on the cross, is some influence on the recent situation of the world, feeling from the cross. Also a criteria for calling Stein doctor of the church.
Is some influence on the research? Well, yes, I think I think I selected her message of the cross because this is such an important topic today. Like, despite, I mean, we are in the West, here in the West of Europe, but Christians are martyred all over the world. And I think her example, I have really touched the surface of what is her legacy in that respect. But she really shows where to find strength to endure suffering, any form of suffering, not just martyrdom, by her an example of really just clinging on to the cross. There's no other way you can endure suffering. And we have had lots of martyrs in the early church, in the ancient church, but they have not written anything about their martyrdom. There's lots of early church martyrs, but they did not pass on the message of how to deal with it. And I think Edith Stein did, and this is why she's so relevant. And I can see one more question about why Edith Stein is a doctor of the law. And after the presentation, it was thank you. Yes, okay, yeah.
Okay. If there are future questions or comments, we can conclude the work of this meeting. Thanks, Piotr, Marianne, and Jadwiga for this work.
Thank you.
Congratulations.